So the backlog of child abuse cases have got lesser and lesser because there are more hearings. But what this lawyer also told me was, you know how when you bring a rape victim, particularly a child, in front of a jury or a judge, you're putting them through that experience again and again, and more often than not, they clamp up. And so the outcome of it is not the wanted outcome, I would say. But yeah, so the situation worldwide, though, I mean, the statistics are staggering because it says estimated about 1 billion children from the ages 2 to 17 have experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence or neglect in the past year alone. And that is a staggering number. You know, I think as adults, it is also important for us to understand that it's not just the physical and sexual abuse that we talk about quite often. We kind of forget the emotional and the mental abuse that a child would go through. There's a lot of talk generated about sexual and physical abuse, but the mental and emotional aspect of it is sometimes not talked about as often. And I feel that it is as important on the spectrum of child abuse as the physical abuse, the emotional abuse. So I think when creating awareness and, you know, when educating children and adults, I think it is important also to touch on the aspect of this emotional and mental abuse, because the effects are long lasting.
All right, thank you so very much for that very insightful outtake to this. And from there, I would like to move on to Dr. Ganesan. Your question, in the field that you are in, I'm sure you would have studied and understood many cases based on this. Tell me, what type of effect does an abused child have when it comes to a wholesome lifestyle? And what type of trials does that sort of continue throughout, not only their childhood, even during their adulthood?
So thank you very much for inviting me to talk about child abuse, because, as you said, it's a very important pandemic or epidemic or whatever that we don't talk about. So that's a huge issue. I mean, why it is a huge issue is just because of that, the impact it has.
Are they having difficulties with the signal? Have we lost Dr. Ganesh? Can any other panelists hear me? Or can all hear me? Ah, you're back?
I think we've lost it. Oh.
The difficulties of internet at times, I'm telling you. Shall we move on to the other question and come back? Is that okay, Dr. Ganesh? We will move on to the other question and come back to you. And this, of course, to Kimarli. How are you doing this evening? You can hear me? All right. As a chairperson, when it comes to tourism in our country, I'm sure you come across many cases where this has been brought up to you in terms of children who are subjected to abuse. We are not speaking about the problems, but we want to find solutions. And how do you handle this, and how challenging has it been? You can't hear me? Not me. You can't hear Kimarli. Right.
Kimarli, we can't hear you.
You're not on mute though, but I really don't know. Kimarli? We are unable to hear her. All right. Until we get these technical hitches sorted off in the background, I'm just going to speak a little bit about what is the purpose of today's forum is to create awareness about child abuse to children so that they can prevent themselves, which is the most important thing. It's the unspoken pandemic, and it clearly does sort of go with it. As much as we give priority to a lot of things, I think we need to always harvest energy, effort, and time in creating a safe and a sufficient environment for the youth of tomorrow to live in. And that's the most important thing. While we wait for Kimarli, I'm just going to move on to Mr. Jayasuriya. If you can speak to us a few minutes. Yes, I think he is there. How can you identify when a child is in a vulnerable situation where this child actually face abuse?
Thanks, Danu, for that question. I hope everyone can hear me.
Loud and clear.
Yes. This is actually a very timely question, Danu. One that we get asked a lot by concerned parents. Well, it's important that everyone, particularly parents, are able to identify when children might be at risk of abuse. I think the advice I would give first and foremost to parents who want to identify if a child may be in an environment that makes them vulnerable to abuse is that you need to educate yourself and break away from assumptions. We find parents very often assuming that their child is in a safe environment simply because it's a place that is known to them. Like a relative's home, it could be a friend's home, places of worship. People automatically assume that these are always safe places for their children. We know that is not always true. Children are vulnerable to abuse anywhere, even in their own homes. So therefore, it's extremely important that parents are watchful and vigilant, especially taking precautions and keeping an eye out for warning signs that their children might be at risk. We also need to be selective about whom we invite into our homes and whom we expose our children to. You need to remember that most child abuse takes place in the safest of settings, very often by very abusers whom the child trusts. Now here I'm not saying that you need to be paranoid and assume that everyone you meet is a child predator. But you need to be mindful that more often than not, children are abused in what we generally consider as safe spaces. So it's difficult to say exactly what sort of environments might make a child susceptible to abuse, but certainly children who are often left unsupervised by parents for long hours in environments that could potentially expose them to strangers. Another point would be that children who are not taught about abuse and how to identify it are less likely to be able to protect themselves, making them more vulnerable in the society. Also, home environments where children are not encouraged to talk and express themselves or share their feelings or talk about their day, about their friends, etc., are more likely to be vulnerable to abuse as they don't have an outlet to share their experience with an adult. So we at Leeds feel that the issue of child abuse has become very much like an unspoken pandemic. And just like the pandemic, it's everyone's responsibility to ensure the safety of our children. So be vigilant and cautious at all times, and be prepared to act promptly when we identify any warning signs or symptoms. We need to create environments where children feel safe to tell their stories and feel comfortable to talk about such things without them feeling embarrassed or scared, I would say. So if you look at it like this, we often say it takes a village to raise a child, but then it also takes a village to keep a child safe too.
Thank you so very much for that. Definitely, it is something that we need to pay attention to. I think it is a joint collective decision that we can all contribute towards a child's well-being. All right, on that note, I'm going back to Dr. Ganesh. You know, the issue when it comes to how mentally and physically a child is challenged because of this very cruel act could always have a tarnishing mindset, not only today, but also as a child grows up and becomes an adult and faces the world. Dr. Ganesh, give us an insight to how and how can we sort of understand this and how kids or children feel during this process.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I got disconnected. The issue of child abuse is a very traumatic experience for the child. As I said earlier, the child is a growing organism. It's learning new things, but things that they learn are incorporated into them, which can go on for life forever. So things that we learn in childhood have an impact. Unlike the adults, it has an impact throughout the lifespan of the child. So that's why it's extremely important that we make sure that the children don't go through abuse as such. I mean, children also have different abilities to cope, especially emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect. These are some forms of child abuse that children go through. So child sexual abuse is the worst, and that's where the child suffers most. And as said by my previous speaker, very often, more than 95% of the abuse happens by a person who is well known to the child, who has access to the child. Abuse by unknown person that happens in a one-off manner, the impact of the child is going to be quite minimal. But when the abuser is well known to the child, it's a relative or teacher or a neighbor or somebody like that, very often the abuse continues over a period of time. And then the impact on the child's life is much, much worse. So as the child grows up, they will suffer in a very bad way with emotional distress and disorders. They will have extreme anxiety. They will very often go through a very bad depression where they want to commit suicide, where they think life is not worth living. Some of them commit suicide as adults because of the trauma that they suffered in the childhood. Also, they have other problems like developing relationship with other people. Trusting relationships are an important part of anybody's life. And children who undergo abuse find it extremely difficult to form trusting relationship. It can be friends, it can be a partner in life, and even in workplace, sometimes they struggle to form these trusting relationships. And that can have an impact on their well-being, their happiness, career progression, family life, well, every aspect of life for that matter. So these are some of the huge problems that they have. And also very often people, as I said, undergo depression, anxiety, which are extremely resistant to treatment. It's very difficult to treat because very often what happens is as a child grows up, the abuse memories are suppressed. They're kept underneath. And so very often what the adult person sees as problems, they find it very difficult to connect to the abuse experience. So very often that connection between the suffering that we are having as adults and the cause for the abuse, for the suffering that is the abuse, very often goes undetected. So unless we dig very deep, it's often very difficult to find out the abuse experience. And then coming to physical abuse, unfortunately, again, physical abuse of children is extremely common. It still happens in schools, still happens at home, where somehow we have got the idea that beating up children doesn't harm them. When it comes to beating up of adults, we are very sensitive. We call it torture. We call it emotional torture, physical torture, and we are very sensitive to it. But when physical abuse happens to children in the form of physical punishment, unfortunately, as I said, it's very common. And that also has a huge impact. Because one of the things that we know is whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse, the victims who suffer from it very often do become perpetrators as well. So if there's one child who is sexually abused or physically abused, when they grow up, they can end up abusing a large number of people with a kind of a multiplication effect. So this is why we have to put a full stop to abuse and try to minimize it. So the impact of abuse is huge. And a lot of people going on to becoming addicted to alcohol, becoming abusive parents, becoming abusive in workplaces are very often the same people who have suffered physical abuse or emotional abuse in the school or home when they were children. So these are the problems that they have.
Thank you so very much. That's a very insightful thing. And of course, sometimes the ones who we move with the most are the ones who could actually create the highest amount of damage to our children. And this is something that we need to create awareness about. From there, we move on to Kimarli Fernando. Happy to have you back with us. So on the same lines as the chairperson of Sri Lanka Tourism, how do you face such situations and how have you found solutions for such things that have been brought to your attention?
Sure. Thank you, Danu. I'm working off my phone, so I hope it's clear. From the Sri Lanka tourism perspective, obviously, we look at from a tourist perspective, right? So we're looking at when tourists come in, are they safe? Now, that's not going to help our discussion today too much because I'll quickly tell you that we have, there's a DG appointed specifically for tourism, DIG, and we are having a travel app and an emergency button connected to the app and so on. And we are looking to how we can support the tourists when they come in. Now, when you look at child abuse in Sri Lanka and everywhere else in the world, and particularly Sri Lanka, is that, you know, we say child abuse and adults, and we create that distinction because our culture is that anyway, where we say adults, we listen to adults, we don't question adults, and that kind of a culture is there in Sri Lanka. So I think we need to look at kind of two areas. Now, how to protect themselves is something that we have to advise them and teach them and be with them. I don't know whether how many children even know what is abuse, because abuse, as the previous presenters mentioned, are four broad areas, which is a physical abuse, sexual abuse, which is rape, molestation, child porn. We have neglect, which is physical neglect, medical neglect, education, you neglect education-wise. So those are then emotional abuse, obviously verbal, mental, and psychological, and all that, which was explained before. So I think first we need to do immediately is go into schools and teach children what is abuse, first of all, right? Tell them this is all abuse. And frankly, if you talk to all of us adults, if you go through those 3-4 things, headings, all of us have faced some sort of a thing, like emotional abuse, like verbal abuse. I'm sure a lot of us have faced in school and outside as children. Psychological abuse. So it depends on the level it goes to and the impact it has. So I think that having role models who come out and say, look, I was abused, and then sort of create a hype about coming forward as children saying so and so. And you see that done in Europe now at the moment with bullying, where really famous Hollywood, Bollywood stars
Kimarli, you have muted your phone.
These are the things, I mean, where you could look at, where you get role models in Sri Lanka who say, okay, I was abused, but look where I am. I mean, in the West, you get lots of Hollywood stars who come out and say, you know, I was bullied, and look where I am. And there is like, people are now fearful to bully. I think there needs to be like a movement in a way where there's, where you create that hype about it. First, educating children, what is actually abuse? This is abuse, that is abuse. Your body is your own. Nobody has a right to touch you. And also, abuse is so many other things as well. I think if you teach children first, what is abuse, and then you look at the adults and upskill them, if you like, as to what they need to do. And also the peers, I mean, the students, to also upskill the peers, their friends. Because with social media and all that, I think that we need to have a different approach to handling this rather than the ways we probably handled before. So we need to look at our culture, the respect for elders. We need to look at that. And is that something we're going to address? Are we going to look at the urban and rural cultures and say, okay, without having a one approach to Sri Lanka and say, okay, we are going to handle child abuse, to say urban, this is how we're going to handle rural population and that culture, the way they work, you have to handle it in a different way. The ethnicities, the religious cultures, we need to maybe zoom in on projects which is reflective of the community that child is living in. That could be the priest they go to, or the temple they go to, or a church they go to, or a mosque they go to, or it's maybe the principal or a teacher, we don't know. So the stigma angle you can reduce, as I said before, if you get some people talking about it, saying, you know. The other area is the treatment of girls. I mean, this is an issue that I personally feel passionate about, and I think the way we treat girls and the way that is a huge concern. And lastly, I think the poverty angle also probably has an impact. Now, Save the Children has a sort of an index, if you like, a childhood index. In 2018, we didn't rank too bad, but we were 60 out of 175 countries. Just to get an idea, Singapore was the best, and then Slovenia, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, South Korea, these were the best. So I think that we should look at how do we first educate our children what is abuse and what is just not acceptable, and then talk about possibly later on what we should do to get there.
Thank you for that, Kimarli. We would also like to tell, for those who are watching this right now on our live Facebook feed, or if you're joined us on our Zoom platform, you could send in your questions here or leave your questions as comments. We'll be more than happy to take in these questions as we do come back with after our second section of this. Right. Let's move on to Mr. Dulinda Perera. This is an interesting topic. Social media is one of the biggest things today, and everyone is quite easily accessible on social media. As much as it's the most important thing, social media is also quite a playground for such vicious things to happen when it comes to digital abuse. And children facing abuse could also happen in terms of being vulnerable videos, photographs in vulnerable places, or in vulnerable situations could be leaked, and these could be eventually moved into mental abuse and even abusing them emotionally. Now, there's such a vast area, and how are you going to handle it is a big problem, but tell me your take on this, and how can we inform our children about the situations that they might come up and might face on their social media platforms?
Thanks, Danu. Thank you for the interesting question. I think a substantial substance of my answer was covered within your question itself. The question was structured in such a detailed manner. Yes, as interesting as it may, I'll tell you both the pros and cons. I think even at this very minute, we are having a very interesting conversation utilizing social media as the form of communication. So there's always the good and bad. There's always two sides of the coin. And I feel social media has created so much of opportunity for such conversation to take place. Social media has taken the opportunity for certain entities of the sort of leads to come out and speak about this, educate people, and make sure that people are really understood about what we are talking about. Because I think rightly, as Ms. Rambukwella and Mrs. Fernando mentioned, a lot of people might not even know that you're being abused. A lot of children might not know what abuse is in the first place. So I think educating them is the most important thing. But that being said, I think the type of abuse that happens on social media, very respectfully for children, happens in my opinion, I think about in mainly three different categories. First is obviously the fact that social media is built on the principle of networking. The very principle allows perpetrators of such sexual and physical crimes that much easier for them to find children online. Right? Because I think Dr. Ganesan would agree with me, children in nature crave for attention, for appreciation, to say that they look nice, they look good, and so on and so forth. So it makes all the more easier for perpetrators to find such children online, which leads into various different crimes. For an example, I think Ms. Rambukwella mentioned the figures of NCPA, and if we look at about out of the 5,600 crimes that has been 600 odd crimes that has been reported, I think the source of these crimes, closer to, according to the NCPA report of 2019-2020, the source of this crime is social media and referrals, about 67%. So which gives you an idea how much of a role social media is playing in terms of allowing these perpetrators to find these children. Well, a second aspect of it is technically the mental torture and harassment that certain children needs to go through simply for existing within social media. Now, this can happen by adults, by elders, people who are relatively elder to that child, or else by contemporary children, colleagues of their own, batchmates of their own, where, you either body shame that child or you say something one or another about that child within social media, which leads to a series of mental and physical issues, and which really demoralizes a child and ruins a child's confidence. And by doing so, we literally mitigate the children's ability to be the next generation leaders. Because by the time they come out as a leader or a young adult, their confidence is gone as such, because they've been bullied, harassed, and embarrassed within the community of social media. Another part I think that we tend to forego is the commercialization of children within social media. I think if you look at Sri Lanka, this is a very, very sad situation. If you look at multiple number of content creators who publish and who specializes on content with respect to children, where children are saying interesting stuff. Sometimes this interesting stuff is where children are literally uttering filth on camera. They're basically talking about certain things that a child might not be able to come up on their own. Usually, as people who are within this space, when we dig into these sort of areas, we can always see there is an adult making money out of these sort of content, because you might probably know social media is advanced up to now where you can monetize your platforms. So you use children as commercial objects and literally ask them to say things which they might not even understand what they mean, and you make money out of it. And that's another form of abuse, child abuse, that we might not really talk about. And at the end of the day, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, when that child comes into the society and he really understands what he's been telling all this time, by that time the entire character and the self of that child is entirely destroyed. So I think there's multiple different avenues, but we can boil down to these three different sections of how social media contributes to child abuse in general.
Thank you so very much. It's just quite insightful to know that, how much we love and enjoy social media and how much we love and enjoy this platform that is freely available could also be such a tarnishing and a crippling platform that could be used in such a quick way. But thank you so very much for that very insightful answer. Now I'm going to move to our sixth question for today. Now, there was another point that Kimarli brought up, which was quite fascinating, with the fact that coming out and speaking about such things and making awareness about success stories and, being brave enough to share your abuse. And believe it or not, it's quite alarming in Sri Lanka, I think, as much we would like to ignore. But if you have taken public transport, you have been abused in some form. And I have been a victim of it. It doesn't matter of the gender, it doesn't matter of the age, it doesn't matter who you are. Even my mum had got abused, and I used to not understand these type of things that used to happen, and that's why children are more vulnerable. But what I want to speak about is next to Ms. Kuruwita, if you're there, a little bit about why do you think it's important for children to encourage children to speak about it, and how can we actually provoke this conversation in them, at least to ask about it? Because I don't think when I have felt things in a bus, I have never felt it as a problem to come and speak about it. But whereas we have always feared something that is strange, but how can we provoke that conversation in a child?
So the thing is, if I was having a conversation with an adult and I brought up, let's say, something, sexual activity, the conversation would stop, right? And it will get awkward and I'll get judged because anything related to sexual activity is such a taboo topic to talk about within our society, right? As a kid, you mention it and all the adults around you say that you're too young to talk about it. And as you grow up, you ultimately never have that conversation with an adult because it's just too awkward. So in fact, so when I went to the school, this 15-year-old kid asked me whether the mother could get pregnant when the father kisses the mother's stomach, right? And when I mentioned this to my friend, what she's told me was that in reality, there are so many within schools, there are so many teachers who skip the topic of reproduction found in the human biology textbooks because it's such an awkward topic to talk about and teach your children, right? And ultimately, if we can't talk about the topic of reproduction, how can we feel comfortable talking about something like abuse? And so even if you do speak up, right, and you talk about abuse, physical, sexual, any type of abuse, you're afraid that you would get judged. Because a lot of society villainizes the victim and kind of asks questions like, what was the victim wearing? Or they predict that the victim's future marriage would not seem well. Whereas you're afraid of that judgment, so you don't really talk about it. And then ultimately, even if you do talk about it, there's that fear of your family being blamed, right? People could ask questions like, why didn't you protect your child? So ultimately, you're at crossroads because you're afraid of speaking out. You're simply afraid of speaking out because of that judgment you get from society. And therefore, I think initially you should try to reduce the stigma surrounding victims of abuse to get us to start talking. And even if you do speak out, right, there are two ways in an abuser will try to stop you from speaking out. In terms of, let's say, bribes, right? They say they'll pay for your education. They can say things like they'll take care of your family, or they could emotionally manipulate you in the sense that, especially if it's someone you're close to, right? If it's someone you respect, they could say things like, if you speak out, it would affect, like, you would ruin my life, and kind of make you feel as if you're the bad person, ultimately not making you want to speak out. And then there's that other extreme of threats, right? They could physically threaten you and say things like they'd harm you and your loved ones if you speak out. Or there's a threat of power, because ultimately there's the person who abused you. It could be a teacher. It could be someone authoritative within your school. It could be someone authoritative, let's say, within a place you're employed at, because some of us do have part-time jobs, right? And ultimately, you're afraid to jeopardize your education. You're afraid to jeopardize that. Speaking out will ultimately jeopardize your future. And and especially if you're a male, like the oldest male child in the house, a lot of your family expects you to be the next man in the house, supporting the family and whatnot, right? So ultimately, if your future is jeopardized, that's a fear of not being able to support your family in the future. And so that's just one extreme of things, right? There's an other extreme of domestic abuse, where in fact, like nowadays, hitting a child as punishment is normalized within our society, right? But ultimately, as it progresses, you don't know where it stops, because it can stop at the child getting beaten up, which is ultimately not a punishment. It cannot be justified as discipline. It is abuse, right? And especially if it is domestic, you're scared because the adults surrounding you in your household are the ones who you're afraid of. So ultimately, where do you go, right? And even if you speak out, especially if you have siblings, you're afraid that your siblings might kind of go through that same cycle, so you don't speak out.
So very often when they get beaten up by teachers in school, the children don't come and tell at home. One, they will either beaten up by their parents again. You must have done something naughty, that's why the teacher hit you. Or the parents might go and fight with the teacher, where the child getting abused again by the teacher is very high, or punished in other ways is very high. So very often children don't want to talk about abuse. So the empowerment of children and empowering the children to say things that they feel and respecting those things, not that we agree always with whatever the child says, but we need to respect what the child says, listen to what the child says, and then come to a conclusion whether that's okay or not, and then talk about it. So very often parents feel very bad when children are empowered, and we put down children who try to be empowered. No, you are a child, you have to listen to adults, you have to listen to what the adults say. But there is a dangerous side to that, right? So whenever we tell the child the adults are always right, you should never go against the adults, obey the adults always, we are putting the first blocks for abuse to happen. So this empowering of the child can start from the age of like 1 to 2 years itself, where the child wants a particular food, doesn't want a particular food, want to dress in a particular way, doesn't want to dress in a particular dress. We need to respect and at least listen to the child. And when children ask questions, we should answer them, right? Very often we don't ask those questions. We push the child away. They may look like silly questions, but they have a right to ask those questions, and we have to answer them in a way that the child can understand. That is where we make a mistake, and this child will stop asking questions and giving comments as well. And that's where the separation happens. And when actually abuse happens, the communication between the parents and the child is unfortunately too far apart. And the child doesn't feel that connected to the parents to actually go and talk about it. So having that communication, children will ask stupid questions like, why is the sun, what's the moon, what's the sky? They can, but it's our responsibility as parents to be patient and try to answer them as truthfully as possible. It's the same thing with teachers. Teachers are under a lot of pressure to cover the syllabus, to make sure that to prepare the children for the exams. And very often the teacher-child relationship, I'm not saying it's universal, but unfortunately in Sri Lanka, the teacher-child relationship is very poor. But even though I say that, even in Sri Lanka today, a lot of child abuse is picked up in schools. Children feel much more comfortable talking to teachers rather than their parents, and teachers very often bring up these abuse instances. So that is good. So as the child grows older, 3, 4, we have to teach the child where the others are allowed to touch. What are our private parts of the body? right? Again, when a relatives come home, they love to kiss the children, and the children don't like it. How much we respect that, right? And how much we try to go, when we go to a relative's house or a friend's house, when there are small children, we try to kiss them against their wish. We should avoid that practice. And we also need to empower children. If they don't like it, they don't have to go through it. Whoever it is, it can be your grandparents, it can be anybody. The children have to be empowered to learn to respect their body and to protect their body. And even like changing clothes, even a 3-year-old can be taught whom he or she should allow to change clothes, right? I mean, sometimes when we go to weddings, funerals, and birthday parties, there are others who can come in, and those are the more vulnerable places where children gets abused because parents are busy with other things. So it's important to teach the child who can take you to the washroom, who cannot take you to the washroom. So these are things that can be taught to a very small child. We don't have to talk about child abuse. We don't have to talk about anything else, but we can talk about the safety. And also, in other countries, children are taught, like, if somebody is behaving wrongly with you, whom should you talk to? Go to a nearby woman. If you are alone, go to a nearby woman and tell her to call the police or something. So these mechanisms can be taught to children in schools or in homes to help them to protect themselves. Then coming to sexuality, this has undergone, we have talked about it so much, right? Unfortunately, it's considered such a taboo subject, and it's, for some funny reason, we say it's culturally inappropriate to talk. I don't know where this culture came in and whether this is actually the culture of the different communities in Sri Lanka. I don't know. But we have to have a way of cut through this. Though there have been many attempts to teach children about sexuality, because that is one of the problems we have. Children don't know how babies are made. Right? Children very often don't know, even 14-year-old, 15-year-old children don't know when they are sexually abused that this is abuse, because they don't know normal human sexuality. And we have to start teaching them. Again, it has to be done in a very culturally sensitive manner, as the previous speakers talked. And it has to be introduced in a very gradual manner, about in a kind of a very normal way. Unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, teachers find it very uncomfortable to talk about these things. Maybe because it's not written or it's not done in a way that they are comfortable to talk about. So it is the designers of school textbooks and school curriculum who have to go back to the drawing boards and start talking about sexuality in a very simple, easy manner, again starting at about 10 or 12, just before the children start getting puberty. That is the best time to start introducing it in a sensitive manner. So empowering the children is extremely important. Without empowering somebody, we can't assure their safety. Very often we feel as parents, we can protect our children. That's not going to happen, right? So we are not going to be there all the time. They are going to be among other adults who can potentially abuse our children. So it is important that we empower our children to protect themselves and feel free to talk about it to us, if whatever that happens to them, whether it's right or wrong, so that we can decide whether there was abuse and then take remedial action.
All right. Thank you so very much for that insightful answer, Dr. Ganesh. We're going to move on to our next question. That's, of course, to Dulinda Perera. Now, as someone who's in the marketing field, we want to speak a little bit about how can brands foster and strengthen the future of our youngsters, and how can we sort of see and give a platform to create awareness about child abuse and create this wave so that the corporate world also is involved in it?
Yeah, thank you, Danu. So that's actually, I think the audience represents a portion of the corporate world over here. We have representation from some of the biggest corporates that is operating within Sri Lanka. So I think it's quite an insightful question. To address you on that, there are certain, as you may probably will be aware, in the corporate communication exercise of a lot of corporates and a lot of entities, they focus on different areas that is related to their core area of business in adding value, in making sure those particular stakeholders within those particular divisions and sectors are benefited in multiple different ways. So usually what happens is aligning with the strategic direction of a corporate entity. They try to align the CSR activities that they do and fund certain activities. Sometimes partner up with entities such as leads, where they are technically hands-on on the field, where they will have the manpower, the resources to completely execute certain activities of that sort. However, if you take an overall look at the Sri Lankan corporates, there are multiple different areas that we focus upon, like agricultural sustainability, computer literacy, making sure that children are well educated, that women empowerment, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of different areas. But sometimes we see that there is a certain lack towards entities specifically focusing on prevention of child abuse and making sure that their efforts, their resources, that their funds are utilized in this sort of a domain, because this is also a very costly venture. I'm sure if directed towards Mr. Monroe, he can vouch upon that fact. This is a very complicated, very sophisticated process, because we are dealing with children, a very sensitive element of nature, and thus it involves a lot of resources, a lot of costs, a lot of funds that can be utilized. So predominantly, I would say, in the process of creating value, in the process of creating residual value for that matter, in terms of allowing their specific sectors to prosper and grow, brands should and brands could actually partner up and back up certain activities, initiatives, very specifically taken by entities predominantly in this sector of work, because it's not something that a corporate entity that is focusing on a different line of business can actually focus upon, because they have a separate core line of business that they have to focus upon. So one of the key ways that they can actually, and that's something that we've seen is over the years of corporate communication, we've seen people partnering up, we've seen people sponsoring and empowering certain initiatives as such. I'm sure that Mr. Monroe can add to that component, where certain massive corporates have partnered up with leads over the years in empowering certain activities as such, and ensuring that while that is being there, another way that corporates can, or rather another way that brands can actually contribute to the whole initiative is by making sure that they actually include certain key elements that needs to be communicated to the society in their brand communications, because as you would probably know, this has a huge mileage, huge reach. I think both of us come through on the digital platforms quite too often, and we would understand that the brands would have quite a bit of mileage, and certain brands which backs up with certain bit of purpose, it has a certain credibility as well in certain sectors of the society, and certain TGs, they relate to this particular brand very much, and coming from the brand, it will speak a lot of value. An example I could give you is a specific campaign that Vodafone ran for women empowerment back in Middle East, which was a huge success. So I think in both of these domains, brands can contribute to making sure such initiatives are well noted, and that they see the light of the day.
Thank you. And I think when advertisements and publicities, big brands like how you said Vodafone, when they come forward creating awareness about stigmas, I think that's one of the easiest way to break it. It could be for colorism, it could be for sexuality abuse, whatever it could be. We tend to create a bigger platform, because when we see such big brands investing money and advertising space to create some kind of awareness and at the same time pass the message of their brand. We have lots of questions coming in, which we'll be addressing in a little bit. But I would like to now go to Mr. Jayasuriya, who is here. There you go, from Leeds. How should we educate a child on child abuse, and how can we handle the situation, the state of abuse?
Yes, Danu. When it comes to Leeds, we actually conduct awareness programs for children from a very early age, as Dr. Ganesan also mentioned, to raise awareness amongst children on child abuse. You need to begin by talking to the child about touch in general. One point would be, it is so important that parents build an open and honest rapport with their children, so that children are made aware from an early age that their bodies are unique, that they are special, and their bodies belongs to them. Children also must be made to understand that certain areas of their bodies are private and others are not allowed to touch them unless it is for medical purposes, in which case it would be by a doctor with their parent, with their parent present in the room at all times. Children need to know about the good and the bad touch. We often find that this is taught even in nurseries to children who are very small. If you take, it could be the age of 2 years, 2.5 age category as well. This teaches children that sometimes you can be touched in a way that hurts you or makes you feel uncomfortable, even by someone you know well and trust. So this is not a good touch. So you must talk about it to another adult. Also, children should be taught that whenever they feel uncomfortable or pressurized, they can speak to an adult, someone they trust, especially if they are being forced to keep a secret, or if the secret is hurting them or involves hurting someone else. If they are being threatened to keep the secret, if they are uncomfortable and feel guilty about it, they should tell another adult about it. Children should be given specific instructions by parents, especially, that if they ever feel that they are in a vulnerable situation, they should say no, or they should run away from that particular place, scream and draw attention as loud as they can, or tell an adult immediately. So Leeds as an organization has developed tools for various age groups. So what we just discussed are some of the tools that are used for the younger children. But parents and guardians would need to use different tools and tactics when dealing with teenagers. With all the older teenagers, it is extremely important that parents have an open and honest conversation with them, addressing topics such as love, relationships, trust, lust, etc. So, and also it is equally important that we note the role that technology and internet can play in educating our children regarding abuse. So in partnership with the Ministry of Education, Leeds along with Save the Children and World Vision have launched an online course for children aged 13 and above. You can encourage your children to register themselves and complete this course, especially on eTaksalawa website, by logging in through www.cybersafety.lk. All children who complete the course are awarded an e-certificate by the Ministry of Education. My advice to parents and guardians who might have to handle situations of child abuse would be, first and foremost, always listen to the child. Don't ever react out of anger and scold the child. Abuse is never the child's fault. So first, just listen to the child. You may respond differently depending on the situation. So if it is grave and there is an injury and pain, you must first take the child to hospital to ensure that the child's health is not at risk. If that is not the case, you still need to ensure further safety of the child. So please report the incident to the police. You can also report the incidents to the National Child Protection Authority by calling their hotline, which is 1929. You can also take the child to the Child Rights Promotion Officer at the Divisional Secretariat. And also another way is you can contact organizations that focus on child protection, such as LEADS, who can provide you support. So the LEADS hotline is 075 712 1212.
Thank you for that. That was very much full of information, and I'm sure you can follow LEADS on their social media platforms to come to know more details as well. Thank you so very much. From there, moving on to Kimarli, and this time around, it's not about tourism, but it's about being a mum. The question to you is, how would you approach your child to talk about safety and sexual abuse?
Sure. Well, with regards to being a mom, I mean, my kids are now, of course, very much bigger now, but what I used as a practice was I got them to watch documentaries and things and real life stories after a certain age of how people have survived things, to be honest. Because, you know, what happens is that when they see that TV, even Anne Frank, as a child, when we read Anne Frank's diary, it has a tremendous impact on me. And I gave books to read on people who have survived in different things. They were in jail, unfairly treated, or they've survived through some illness, or survived through. So I think there's so much information from a parent's perspective that you can now, more so than before, if it's YouTube or Netflix, show documentaries and movies even about real life situations that people have overcome. Give them books to read. And when you say communication, I mean, frankly, I mean, adults are ill-equipped. Majority of adults are ill-equipped to solve this problem, I feel. And I think that they need training as well. So I think this problem needs to look at in two ways. I mean, you've got to train the trainer, as it were, which is the parent and the teacher and everybody, all adults should be trained. And then the students should be trained. And I have a different perspective on technology a little bit, in that I think that technology can be amazing in solving this problem now, more so really than ever, because I think we should have a proper syllabus, like modules on from the age of 5, what you would show the child a module, and in school you should be showing this module 1 to 15 or whatever, where you show the child modules, and every term you have some activity around sexual abuse or emotional abuse or whatever the type of abuse. So it should be like a module learning, and I think technology should be used, and we should work with the health ministry on some stuff like this, right, going forward. With regards to the communication skills, I think we keep saying communication skills, but I think we need to put our child, which I did for my kids, you know, for debating, put them for players, get them on stage so that they have confidence, put them for sports. So it's not just communication skills, but when you have other skills and a sense of sort of empowerment, that you feel that you are unique, you are special, and you are important, and that sense of feeling that, and then that the sense of the confidence to be able to say, stop that, I don't, you know, you have no right to do that. You need to have that confidence to be, and even if they take on, you know, roles in a team or a captain or whatever, I mean, I think all that builds up people's ability to meet up with it. The negative side of technology was already spoken to and absolutely spot on. But I think the sexual education, the sexual health, I think the teachers and parents can't do. I mean, you have fathers say, don't even say wife, right? In the village sometimes they say, Lamai ge amma. That level of respect. So there's no discussion. I mean, you don't see, in the village particularly, you don't see people holding hands, the mother and father or any kind of, so it's going to be difficult for a parent, really, depending on which area you're coming from, to be doing this. And I think it's kind of our role, in a sense, that to take this on and use technology in a really good way. I think that we shouldn't leave the suicide, youth suicide angle. We should connect it, because the youth suicide is connected to bullying and mental health issues and all also, I think. And I think that I read some research done on this, and on the youth suicide, which they call below 25 people who commit suicide, and more importantly, attempted suicide, where youth use to commit suicide, they use that as a way of communicating to people. So you have people attempting to commit suicide, and they're telling you a story. So I think that communication has to be looked at in a little bit more broader way. And I think that suicide, sexuality, the sexual health. Another thing is sexual health also has to be taught. It's not only abuse. I mean, how do you look after your sexual health as well has to be looked up. I think it has to be looked at in a far more sort of a broader way, instead of a module form learning. And then the other side of it is, as I said before, having role models. You also can do it from the perpetrator's point of view. Do we name and shame people? Why not? This is something experts need to sort of make decisions on. The court system, how it works, how user-friendly it is, and how you use Skype calling and Zoom calling to do that so the children don't. And then also the child sex offender register. Now, some countries broadcast that. Some states in the US do, some countries in Europe do, some countries have very different view on this. Sri Lanka, we don't have it. I mean, question is that something we need to be talking about at some point? Should we have child sex offenders register and pedophile register? And I mean, should it be part of immigration, for example, when you talk of tourism? Should it be part of, I personally think it should, but I'm not, so these are discussions that has to happen. And I'm really positive. And I think that a lot to do with Dulinda's area, with technology, I think, and working with the education ministry and so on, and you lead and all that, I think we can make a tremendous impact in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimarli. That was very, very important. And we need to start not only speaking about sexual abuse, but also sexual health, which could also be a very important subject that we tend to ignore and forget about. So thank you so very much for that. Chamithri, are you there? There you are. There you are. All right. Now, with your experience in the UN, you would have worked with lots of people from all walks of life. Tell me, how do you think we should approach this situation to the youth here?
Thank you, Danu. I think all of the comments made by all of the panelists are very valid for this question, and most of it has been addressed already. But I just touch upon a few issues that really spoke to me when I was listening to the panelists. One of the first things I said when I spoke first was make it an all-inclusive package, not just talk about sexual exploitation or sexual abuse or physical abuse. Make it an all-inclusive topic, so that all kids who are abused in all different ways are included when we talk about child abuse, whether it's emotional abuse, whether it's physical abuse, whether it's exploitation, negligence, all of it. I think that's one of the first changes we need to do when we start talking about child abuse, which this panel has done fabulously well. When Kimarli just said naming and shaming the perpetrators, I think I agree with her on that, because there's a lot of naming and shaming of the victims. So why not the perpetrators? Because there's a lot of, if a child is taken to courts, even the papers, how our media report it, it's amazing, because it's actually disgusting because your parents can't even go back home with you. The entire village is going to stand there, or the entire towns, even in urban areas. The way they look at that family is stigmatized, right? And I think that should be, I agree with Kimarli on that point, where we should be naming and shaming the perpetrators instead of the victims. And maybe, like she said, in going into the future, having a list of, child abusers, pedophiles, like the Western countries do. And, it affects their entire lives in the future, where they'll even have travel bans imposed on them because of what they're doing. So I think that's a great idea, Kimarli. And to what Dulinda, Dulinda made some really great points about use of technology, because in today's day and age, there's a lot of cyberbullying that takes place. And I think when we talk to our children about abuse, we need to also address the cyberbullying. And a lot of us see people being bullied, even us as adults. Sometimes we go online, we are on a forum, we can see a conversation happen, and we can see a lot of people attacking one single person. And we're just all very comfortable being quiet and not speaking up, even if we can see that other person is right. So as peers, you need to, as parents, you need to educate your children of the importance of standing up to what is right. And if they see someone else being abused or being emotionally distressed on an online platform, you stand up for them and you do what's right by them and by society going forward, because all this can lead to depression, suicides, and that needs to be avoided at all costs. And if it means just standing up for someone, I think all of us can do that, and we can all educate our children to be that kind of person going forward. I think Hithara made some really great comments, because I remember when growing up, as a child, we watch a movie with our parents, and if you see someone kiss each other, you immediately, your reaction is to turn away because you don't want to, because you think that that's something that your parents don't want to see, and that's something that your parents don't want to talk about. And so making your child comfortable enough for them to be able to come and talk to you about things after a certain age, come and have an honest and open dialogue with you as parents, and give them a comfortable enough environment where they don't have to go and seek outside attention and go to the wrong kind of people for that. So I think as parents, I don't have children, so I don't know, I'm just saying, as a child growing up, I had a very comfortable environment with my parents. I would be able to go and talk to them about anything. And that gave me the confidence. That is what gave me the confidence to stand up to anything or anyone and if I thought that they were going to do something wrong to me. So I think it's important that parents create an environment of comfort for children so that they are able to go and talk to them and address issues with your parents. Another taboo topic, I think there's a lot of disagreement on this. I think sex education needs to be introduced into the school curriculum. As Kimarli said, you can do it in modules as per the age, however experts see fit, but I think it is something that needs to be introduced into the curriculum, sex education for boys and for girls, so that it's not the stigma behind this word sex and sexual activity is taken away, and you are aware of what's going on. I think Kimarli in her first session said you need to define what abuse is. You need to educate kids on what abuse is. And I think that can be incorporated into the curriculum, school curriculums, as to in the sex education compartment, and say this is, you educate the child on your body, sex, sexual health, and also what abuse is, so that you're aware of what these are. And then, I think just as much as it is important to educate children, it is also important to educate parents and adults, because if a child, I think Hithara made a comment where someone asked her, if you kiss a woman's stomach, would she be able to get pregnant? But there's a lot of unknown territories, because when children come up to you and ask you questions, uncomfortable questions, you give them all sorts of responses which are untrue, and that leads into children thinking that that is the actual way that things happen. So you need to educate them, educate parents as to how it is possible to have a conversation at certain levels of their ages, depending on how old your child is and what you can tell them. But you can ease them into a conversation and have that conversation and not avoid that conversation. And I think, if you look at all the local and like global organizations, such as governments, the Sri Lankan government or any other government, and the UN and other organizations. I mean, they do such a lot of work. There are so many laws that take care of children. Then there's conventions and acts in place. And yet every year the numbers rise. So we need to look at a more practical approach on how we're going to tackle this. And I think organizations like the NCPEA and LEADS are doing a fantastic job in doing that. I know there's small steps, they may look like small steps, but I think these steps are really important going forward, because unless we take these small steps, we're not going to be able to deal with this issue, and it's going to be a real epidemic in the future. And so I think I would like to congratulate Mr. Monroe Jayasuriya for the fantastic work that they are doing. I think congratulations to you. And I think I'm also aware that LEADS is currently assisting on drafting a national child protection policy, if I'm right. Yeah. And the children's judicial bill and the alternative care policy. So congratulations and fantastic work. And thank you so much for asking me to be on the panel. Thank you.
All right. As our final question that I'm going to put to the one who is representing the people who we are talking about. Hithara, are you there? Yeah. Hithara, as a child, what do you think is the process for you to approach such discussions amongst communities and amongst people of your age or even younger?
I personally think it should start off at that grassroots level. So especially with media, I think social media campaigns do help. But what I've realized is that within social media campaigns, we speak about what abuse is, but not necessarily what to do, not as much what to do when you are abused. And I think that should be addressed as well. But also when I'm speaking about media, I'm also speaking about things like TV and radio, where I think we should start up like discussions about the stereotypes within societies, discussions about how to stay safe and things like that, especially because there's this, in Sri Lankan society, there's this norm of kind of watching TV together as a family. So I feel like that would induce discussions within families about topics that are stigmatized. And so after you start off on that grassroots level, I think it would, since majority of our time is of our childhood is spent in school, I agree that I agree with introducing sex ed to the curriculum, and just also safety protocols from preschool ages, in the sense of according to introducing content that is age appropriate, in the sense of so for preschoolers, you can start off with safety protocols and what the good touch is, and how no one is allowed to touch any part of your body without consent, and then ultimately increasing the information that you provide as you grow older. But I also think that even though this is present within the curriculum, it is important that teachers don't feel uncomfortable talking to us about it. So I think it's important to either train teachers or make teachers aware, which is why I brought in that grassroots level incorporation of media. And also, I think school is, so if these conversations are generated, I feel like teachers and adults within school become more approachable if we are to go through a situation where we are uncomfortable. And it's also very important I feel like, to understand that it's not only girls that undergo abuse, it is boys as well, and you shouldn't limit resources available to girls. I think it should be open to everyone, and there should be that assurance of confidentiality, because as much as we live in a society where we would get judged, right? As of now, you would get judged for what you've gone through. So you need that assurance of confidentiality when you do speak to an adult. But ultimately, I think what's most important is that student network. Because if you're violated by an adult, right, there's a sense of fear of actually trusting another adult, because you're afraid that you might get taken advantage of again. So I feel like, also because as teenagers we tend to rely on our friends more, because it's just more relatable to talk to our friends about our issues. So I feel like the student network is really important, in the sense that so we could start off with student initiated rallies and awareness programs, because if one school starts it, then the other schools follow, and it becomes a domino effect, right? And in addition to all of that, also I imagine that online platforms should be important, in the sense that so actually that I know of this app called Sanvelo, where they have these communities, these group chats on communities based on, like, let's say what you're going through. So it could be depression, anxiety, eating disorders, etc. Whereas you're able to speak to people who are going through the same issues. You can ask them where to get their resources, and that relatability, and it makes you feel safe, and especially because everyone surrounding you understands what you're going through. And ultimately, I think it's important to train teachers and also educate us, not only to know how to respond in such a situation, but also to know how to advise someone going through something similar to, as even as like a child, as if your friend comes up to you and speaks of his or her worries. I think it's really important that you encourage them to speak up to someone, and not just stick with that situation. And I think, yeah, that's so I think you start off at a grassroots level, educating everyone, ultimately reaching schools reaching schools and adults within schools, and creating that network where you would feel protected to come out and follow through the process that follows after you speak up about what happened to you.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to take just a few questions that have come in, and it has been shortlisted by the team that's handling things from Leeds, and have been sent to me. This question is to Dr. Ganesh. Could there be a link between child abuse and the some abuse or ragging that happens in universities, and can we keep these answers quick so that we'll be able to take in more questions as well, if you don't mind?
Yes, I said that, people who undergo abuse do often end up as abusers, right? So as I said, unfortunately, physical abuse and emotional abuse is still very commonly found in our homes as well as schools. We know in schools how teachers put down students, teachers whom they feel the children are not respecting them, the comments they tell the students really do emotionally damage them. So whenever they get an opportunity to become abusers, then that is what we see. I mean, it's the same thing when it comes to domestic violence as well. Why we do have such high rates of domestic violence in our country. 66% of our households have domestic violence, and again, abuse, again, bullying, school bullying, university ragging, and overall violence we see in society is also contributed by the violence suffered by the children.
Thank you. And we've got another question, which is quite interesting, actually. Abuse of younger boys by older boys when it comes to our school system is like, oh, it's just things that happen in school, or, it's just how it is to be in school. And this is a bit of a sad thing that we have to deal with. Now, this I want to speak to Mr. Jayasuriya, who is representing Leeds here. Give us a little bit about how can this be addressed, this trying to make it normal over the fact that, it's because it's school thing and, it's all about having fun.
I think when it comes to abuse, it does not have any gender or does not have an age limit. And it cannot be normalized at any given point. So I think this is where we should, advocate towards taking this child protection into the school curriculum. And that's something we should achieve together, not as individuals. I think as a community, as responsible people, where we should take it towards the Ministry of Education to have it in the school curriculum.
All right. We were trying to keep questions that went with our theme for today, and that is talking about child abuse to children and creating awareness for them. So that is the set of questions we have taken, but we will also like to inform you, leads will be taking in all your questions that you could directly message them onto their Facebook, onto their Instagram pages, and your answers will be provided. Thank you so very much to the panel that joined us today. It has been a bit of a long session, but we are very happy that we got a chance to speak about the importance of creating awareness about children knowing their rights and children acting upon it, and not having more victims who are going to fall short. So as much as we concentrated, we need to create awareness about having a conversation with them early, having a conversation with them about the rights, having a conversation about there's something called sexual abuse, and making them understand that you can take responsibility and you can quickly act on it. And I think we need to be transparent. We need to be vigilant to understand today when kids are born, they kind of are born with an iPad or an iPhone in their hand, because that's how savvy they are when it comes to downloading and uploading photographs and downloading apps and finding ways of using it. So I think kids are now in a broader mind frame to understand. So it should not only be in the urban side, but also into the rural. Whenever we can create conversation, we should, as youth representatives and those who work one-on-one with youth, I think it's our chance to do so. Thank you so very much to the very intelligent and well-spoken panel that joined us today. It has been absolutely an honor to moderate this session with you. Thank you so very much for joining us, and thank you, leads, for giving me the opportunity to speak and also to ask the questions for you. So thank you to all those who joined us, and thank you, everyone.